Mr. President, from that same chair that you're sitting in last week, your chief economic advisor, Charles Schulz, said the recession shows signs of being considerably steeper than had been expected, that unemployment was likely to go somewhat higher than expected. Is your administration preparing some contingency plans for what to do if this recession is as bad as some economists are saying it's going to be?
Yes, we will obviously monitor the conditions of the economy every day as we go through the rest of this year and beyond. We believe that we should not change our basic commitment, though, to fight inflation as a top priority and bring down interest rates and inflation. We've already got good signs on that. Commensurate with it, though, we are maintaining our good established federal programs to deal with those families and those communities that are adversely impacted by unemployment, and also to increase the job commitments and the housing commitments particularly, and the local public works commitments that will help to alleviate the recession which is on us and which has come quicker than we had anticipated, but which we believe will be relatively short-lived.
From CBS News, Washington, a spontaneous and unrehearsed news interview on Face the Nation with the President of the United States. President Carter will be questioned by CBS News White House correspondent Leslie Stahl, by Walter Mears, chief of the Washington Bureau of the Associated Press, and by the moderator, CBS News correspondent George Herman. Face the Nation is produced by CBS News, which is solely responsible for the selection of today's guest and panel.
Mr. President, I don't want to belabor the point, but could you give us some idea of what kinds of stimulative programs you are keeping in reserve to use if the recession proves worse and longer than expected?
Well, in the first place, George, within the concept of a balanced budget commitment and also a strong defense, we have not cut back on any of those programs that deal with the aged, that deal with youth employment, and so forth. As a matter of fact, this summer, and also the summer of 1981, we anticipate 1 million jobs for disadvantaged youth from the age of 15 years old and above. This will help to alleviate the tensions that might exist in a neighborhood that is adversely affected by the recession. In addition to that, I think the best approach to the recession is what we've already done with our anti-inflation policy, interest rates dropping precipitously, and I can predict to you on this program, without much fear of being wrong, that during this summer we will see, following that sharp decline in interest rates, a sharp decline in the inflation rate. This would make it easier to build and to sell homes, to build and to sell automobiles, and restore consumer confidence over a period of time. We have, in addition to that, a new program. It's the only major new domestic initiative that we put to the Congress to provide $2 billion above and beyond anything that we've already got for youth employment. That's for those young people that might be inclined to drop out of their senior and junior high school years, and now to provide them with a job primarily in private industry, both private employment plus training to hold that kind of jobs. In addition, we're trying to protect from overly severe domestic congressional budget cuts the CETA jobs, the local government employment jobs, these kinds of things. And finally, on housing, we've increased the housing commitment for federally assisted homes, 240,000 homes this year, up to 300,000 homes in 1981 fiscal year budget, plus another 100,000 under the so-called 235 program. So these kinds of programs will be designed to alleviate the problems of recession, but we would rather not have the recession. We're going to have one. It has come quicker and steeper than we thought. There are corrective forces already built into the economy.
Mr. President, in the final debate of the 1976 campaign, Gerald Ford said that the public was going to understand and appreciate his performance on the economy. You said that he ought to be ashamed of making that statement with 7.5 million people out of work. You also said that unemployment and inflation were a very serious indictment of the Ford administration. Nearly 7.3 million people are unemployed now, and inflation is worse than it was then. Why isn't that an equally serious indictment of your administration?
It is a serious problem. We face a completely different worldwide circumstance now than we did 4 years ago. In the first place, 4 years ago, we were benefiting from a very stable recent history of oil prices imposed on us by OPEC. during the last part of 1974 all the way through 1975, we had a very low increase in oil prices. In the last more than a year, we've had oil prices on a worldwide basis going up an average of 10% per month. We've had oil prices double in 1 year, and our economy is now having to assimilate those changes. In the last 3.5 years, we have added a net increase of 9.3 million jobs in this country, something that has never been done before. Of those 9.3 million jobs, about 1 million of them went, for instance, to black employees. So we've alleviated the high unemployment rate that I did inherit when I came into office in January of 1977. And we are bringing the interest rates down. And we are going to see, as I've predicted already, the inflation rate dropping precipitously during the latter half of this year, with good inflation reductions during this summer.
Mr. President, you've been speaking along these positive lines in most of your speeches lately. In Ohio on Thursday, you said that we have turned the tide on the economy. You keep emphasizing what you just talked about, and yet unemployment is going up. The latest economic indicators are the worst in the history of the indicators. Most economists say we're plunging into a deep recession. Why do you keep talking about all of this in such optimistic terms? Are you not concerned about your credibility?
Well, I don't have any doubt that we are in a recession, that it is steeper than we anticipated, which I've said twice before in this program, but there are some built-in corrective factors that we can use to minimize the adverse effect of it, in addition to the ones that I've already mentioned, with inflation rate and interest rates coming down, which will stimulate building of homes, automobiles, and consumer purchasing. We also have better federal programs on the books than we've had in the past to deal with a family that is put out of work temporarily or an extended period of time. I've just asked the Congress, for instance, and I have no doubt that they'll give it to us, for about $1.5 billion for impact aid to people who are employed in the automobile industry who are laid off temporarily or for an extended period of time. This will not be nearly so good as having a full-time job, but it helps to alleviate the impact on an individual family. We cannot predict the seriousness of the recession. It's impossible to predict this ahead of time, but on a daily basis, we will be assessing the problem, and if it is worse and more extended than we anticipate, then we will move to emphasize those programs we already have in effect and to deal with it with the Congress.
No new programs, just to emphasize the programs which were put into effect before you knew the recession was going to be so bad?
Well, one question that's come up, of course, is whether to have a stimulative tax reduction. I see no prospect of having a stimulative tax reduction in effect this year. But we will move, if we can cut down excessive federal spending in accordance with the balanced budget proposal I made to the Congress, and if I'm sure that the tax reduction will not be inflationary in nature, we will begin to prepare for a tax reduction to be considered for application in 1981, but not this year.
Mr. President, you keep emphasizing social programs lately, and you fought against a proposal in Congress to increase the military budget. You did that even though your Joint Chiefs of Staff took the unusual step of going public in opposition. How can you defend your argument on the defense increases with that kind of opposition? And how can you tolerate the Joint Chiefs exhibiting so much insubordination to you?
That's not an unprecedented thing, and it's completely compatible with the duties of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. When they are asked a question, could you use more money for defense, they said yes. If you had called in the leaders responsible for housing or transportation or education or welfare or health and said, can you use more money for those programs, they would naturally have said yes. The best thing to do is to look at the record. During the 8 years of Republican administration before I became president, we had a net reduction in real dollars of 30% expenditures for defense, 30% cut over an 8-year period. I've only been in office now a little over 3 years, about 3.5 years.
Reducing it.
And we have had a very good increase in spending. You want me to answer the question?
Yes, but...
Okay, but I'll answer the second question too. We've had a strong growth in our commitment to defense. In the process, we have made the Defense Department much more efficient. We did cut out literally billions of dollars of waste in the Defense Department under my leadership with the Joint Chiefs of Staff agreeing, and also under the leadership of Harold Brown. So to make the Defense Department more efficient and more carefully attuned to our needs to maintain security is an important responsibility of mine. It can't be done with massive spending one year and then a sharp reduction because of an overreaction the following year. We are committed not only to sustain the growth that we've already initiated in the past 3 years for the next 5 years, but I believe that Congress will see the advisability of this, and the future presidents will also, and keep that sustained upward growth intact, regardless of what the inflation rate is, to give our nation its first priority, and that is an adequate defense to give us security.
Could
Mr.
we
President,
save some
could you-
money on the defense budget, considering the way our allies have been cooperating or not cooperating with us? Could we save some money on the defense budget by bringing some more troops home from Europe, cutting down our share of the NATO force?
No, I would not advocate that. We've got about 300,000 American service people in the Europe area to maintain the defense of our allies and also directly to maintain the defense of our own country against communist aggression from the Warsaw Pact. I would not advocate the cutting of those troops at all. What we've done since I've been in office is to set forward a 15-year commitment by the NATO allies for a well-planned improvement in defense expenditures. In accordance with that, we and Germany, Great Britain, and others have agreed to a 3% annual growth, at least, in defense appropriations and expenditures. Our commitment in this country, in accordance with the balanced budget that I submitted and a 5-year plan, is to have a 4% real growth above and beyond the inflation rate in appropriations for defense. This gives us a strong commitment to defense, predictability, good planning, and this defense budget, by the way, was developed by and approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and myself.
Mr. President, could you tell us how the tide is being turned in the case of the American hostages in Tehran?
Well, we haven't made adequate progress there. What we've done since the very beginning is to try to protect the lives and safety of those hostages from the original threats that they would be tried and executed, to build up on a worldwide basis support for our position, the condemnation of Iran, and the calling on the Iranian government to protect those hostages and to release them, and to have an adequate commitment in our own nation's military strength and otherwise, other strength, to protect those hostages and to expedite their release. If you remember early, we were fearful about their very lives because those threats to their safety and to their lives were made openly and publicly. We are facing a horrible example of international terrorism, the holding of innocent people as kidnapped victims, supported by and condoned by the government of Iran. And not only has our country and our allies condemned this action and now imposing multilateral economic sanctions against Iran, but the Muslim countries themselves, of whom Iran is a member, have recently called upon Iran to release the hostages and to resolve this crisis.
And yet the Iranian parliament is now saying that it may be late July before they even discuss the fate of the hostages.
My hope and my prayer is that they will be released very soon, but I cannot predict that.
Do you still consider it a crisis, Mr. President? I notice, looking through transcripts, that some months ago, every time you had visitors to the White House, you mentioned the subject and brought it up yourself. Now it seems to me you mention it somewhat less, or volunteer the subject somewhat less. Is it still a crisis? Should we still be saying on the air every day 100 and 200 or whatever it is?
Yes.
Should we still be flying flags at half-mast, tying yellow ribbons? Is it still a crisis, in
It's
other
still a
words?
crisis.
Why don't you talk
There
about
is
it?
never any time in my, in my day's work that I'm not aware of the fact that 53 American hostages are being held as an act of international terrorism by the people, government, and the terrorists in Iran. We have mounted military force placement, primarily naval forces, in the Indian Ocean and in the Persian Gulf region. We have made a rescue attempt, which unfortunately was not successful, hopefully to get the hostages out. But in its failure even, it showed the determination that we have to protect those 53 hostages. And in addition to our own nation's unilateral actions and economic sanctions, we have now induced our allies to impose economic sanctions as well. I don't believe anyone who's in a responsible position in Iran that don't agree that Iran is suffering economically and politically and diplomatically by the holding of these hostages. Those pressures, although they have not yet been successful, must be maintained. And one of the ways to maintain that pressure is to let the world be reminded every day that the hostages are being held.
But, sir, haven't you sort of changed the signal yourself by coming out of the White House and starting to campaign after saying for so long that you couldn't because of Iran?
Well, to some degree, the circumstances have changed, and to some degree, the emphasis must be changed. After the unsuccessful rescue operation, it became then better for us to concentrate on a broad-based international economic pressure to be exerted against Iran. As a result of that effort, the European allies have now imposed economic sanctions against Iran. A major step, I would rather they be much more severe. In their minds, they are adequate. We can't control those allies, they're independent nations, but they have taken a major step in additional economic sanctions against Iran above and beyond what Iran has had to experience in the past. We hope that all these efforts collectively will be successful in protecting the lives of our hostages, and at the earliest possible moment, I pray that they'll be released, but I cannot predict the date.
Yet they continue to talk of placing the hostages on trial. Will the administration tolerate those people being put on trial in Iran?
The third week in November, I think it was the 20th, we issued a statement that still prevails, in effect prescribing what actions our nation would reserve as options if the hostages are tried or abused in any way. Those actions would be very severe against Iran. We have not closed any option for our nation to exercise, but for me to spell it in detail what we would do, I think would be inappropriate.
Mr. President, the Europeans seem to be moving off in a new direction on the Middle East to propose something perhaps in the United Nations for Palestinian self-determination. Obviously you are opposed to that, is that correct?
Yes. We're making progress on the Mideast peace. If you look at it in a long-term perspective, 2 years ago no one would have thought that Israel and Egypt, the major Arab country, and Israel would be engaged in negotiations to resolve the differences between them. No one would have dreamed that the borders would be open, that diplomatic recognition would have been extended, that ambassadors would be exchanged, that tourists would be flying back and forth between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem on one side and Cairo and Alexandria on the other. At this time, we are still working very closely with the Israelis and Egyptians to resume the formal talks. The basis for these talks and for future progress has got to be UN Resolution 242 and the Camp David Accord document, which is almost like a Bible now. Any attempt that might be made by the European allies to circumvent or to replace this Camp David process would be a mistake, in my opinion. And any attempt made to fragment or to change UN Resolution 242 would be a very serious mistake. We would not permit it. And if necessary, I would take action within the United Nations Security Council to prevent any damage to UN Resolution 242. Obviously, we can't expect an easy resolution of an important and difficult and ancient division as exists between the Arab countries and Israel. But we've now focused upon the few remaining issues, which are very serious, but which are clearly defined. The authority of the self-governing authority within the West Bank Gaza area, land rights, water rights, these kinds of things. And the Israelis know what they are, the Egyptians know what they are, we know what they are, and others around the world who are interested know what they are. We would try to discourage the European allies from injecting themselves into this process as long as we are still engaged in negotiations which might lead to success.
Mr. President, in 1968, Richard Nixon said that he wanted to debate Hubert Humphrey, but not if George Wallace, who was the third-party candidate, was going to be included in the debates. As a result, there were no campaign debates that year. Now, you say that you would debate Ronald Reagan, but not if John Anderson were included. Does that mean that there won't be any campaign debates this year?
I hope there will be campaign debates. The history of the debates are, as you well know, confined to the Republican and the Democratic nominees, the two men that have a chance to be elected president within any reasonable projected expectation. I think the debates are important. In 1960s, the debates between Kennedy and Nixon helped to shape the American opinion about whom they preferred. I don't have any doubt that the 1976 debate between myself and Gerald Ford had a great impact on the outcome of the election. I believe in the two-party system, and I think that the format of the debates helps a great deal in that respect. I see no reason why I should debate against two Republicans who've been active in the Republican Party, who have held positions of leadership in the Republican Party, who have a Republican voting record, who still identify themselves as Republicans. One of them has been successful, Ronald Reagan. The other one has not, John Anderson. Anderson has not won a primary. He didn't even carry his home state. And for me to debate against two Republicans, I think would be a very serious mistake. If there is a desire on the part of Reagan to debate Anderson, I think that should be permitted if someone wants to sponsor such a debate. When and if that's done, or whether or not it is done, then I am eager to debate Ronald Reagan. This would be an opportunity for us not to have a discussion among 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different people, but a sharp debate between two people, one representing the Democratic Party and all it stands for, its history, its present, and its future. The other one, Ronald Reagan, representing the Republican Party and what it stands for, its history, its present, and its future. That's what the American people need to have. And I am eager to meet Ronald Reagan and debate those issues if he and I are the two nominees. And I don't believe that we need to accommodate the desire of other Republicans or independents who might want to be involved in the same
You also
process.
have said that Congressman Anderson is...
Would you make that a trifle harder? Are you saying that you would refuse to enter a debate if Ronald Reagan brought John Anderson in, or if the third party brought John Anderson in?
That's correct.
You would refuse?
That's right. But I am eager to debate Ronald Reagan.
You have said that you think that Congressman Anderson is likely to take more votes away from you than from Governor Reagan.
Yes, whatever success Anderson has in the general election period will be a help to Ronald Reagan and at my expense. There's no doubt.
Would you be equally
Democrats
concerned about
would
debating
say
two
no?
conservative Republicans?
Well, actually, John Anderson's voting record is almost identical to that of the Republican minority leader, John Rhodes, or to other prominent Republicans who identified themselves as very conservative. So I think it's ridiculous for an incumbent Democratic president who's a Democratic nominee, if I am successful, to debate two Republicans simultaneously who come from the same party and who represent generally the same
But aren't
philosophy.
you mostly concerned that Anderson is eating into your support, the Democratic constituencies?
Well, as I said earlier, whatever success Anderson has in November, and that's impossible to predict, it would be more a help to Reagan and more at my expense, yes.
Thank you very much, President Carter, for being our guest today on Face the Nation.
I've enjoyed it.
Today on Face the Nation, the President of the United States was interviewed by CBS News White House correspondent Leslie Stahl, by Walter Mears, chief of the Washington Bureau of the Associated Press, and by the moderator, CBS News correspondent George Herman. Next week, another prominent figure in the news will face the nation. This broadcast was produced by CBS News.